Okay.
Gabriel, go ahead.
Great. So my name is Gabrielle Swaby. I am a manager for diplomacy and partnerships with ACT 2025 at the World Resources Institute. I have been in this world of international climate policy and politics for about 10 years now. I don't know if you want sort of background as well in terms of education. Yes, okay. So I have two bachelor's degrees, one in environmental studies and one in French from the University of Central Florida, and then a master's in environmental policy from University of Oxford. I have been working, as I mentioned, for almost 10 years now across think tanks, NGOs, civil society, philanthropy, the private sector, always around international climate policy and international climate action. Before WRI, I was in management consulting for a couple of years, supporting public contracts around climate action, including the European Climate Pact, which is a EU-wide stakeholder initiative to engage households and individuals in climate action. And before that, I was with the International Institute for Environment and Development in London, supporting negotiators from least developed countries in the UNFCCC. And in my current role at WRI, supporting the ACT2025 consortium, and happy to speak more about that. But maybe I'll stop there and hand over to Alex.
Yes, so thank you for the interview, Mahmoud. And hello. So my name is Alejandra Lopez. I have 20 years of experience on international relations and climate change. I have a bachelor's degree on international affairs and a master's degree about my bachelor degree is from the National University of Mexico, and my master's in environment and development from LSE. I worked around 10 years with the Mexican government in different agencies, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the National Institute on Climate Change. And then I moved as an advisor to ILAC, which is a group of a negotiation group in the UNFCCC of then 8, now 7 Latin American countries, and I have been working with Transforma, which is a think tank, a Latin American think tank, as head of climate diplomacy for the last 2 years. And from the beginning, I have been in this civil society work. I have been engaged with ACT 2025 as one of our flagship work in engaging with other global South think tanks and organizations.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I think I'm speaking to high profile, two people today, and I'm excited to have you guys on board. My first question has to do with the Act 2025. Can you guys elaborate on the specific strategies Act 2025 is advocating for to ensure that COP29 success are prioritized by G7 nations?
Maybe I'm happy to start. So ACT 2025 is a consortium of think tanks and thought leaders and experts across the developing world coming together to amplify and support the needs and priorities of climate vulnerable developing countries in the UNFCCC, but also other multilateral fora covering climate, including the G7. And the consortium does so with the objective of supporting these voices from the global south in an effort to not just to build bridges and find landing zones within the G77, so within developing countries, but across the divide as well with developed countries. And depending on the issue of the year, the consortium does so through a variety of tools and strategies. We earlier this year released a call to action on the road to COP29. And within this call to action, we set out expectations and recommendations of what needs to happen in the lead up to COP and at COP, so as to ensure we see ambitious and just and fair outcomes at COP29 this year. Now, as you may know, climate finance is a big agenda item for this year. And so in complement to the call to action, as you know, the consortium also released this open letter to the G7. But I should say, and I think maybe I'll hand over to Alejandra to speak more to the open letter itself, but I should say that within the call to action, you'll see specifically around it's broken down into pillars that the consortium is highlighting as particularly important for the agenda at COP29 on finance, adaptation, loss and damage, as well as ambition overall. And within the ambition pillar, there is a specific call to G7 and G20 countries to ensure that by early next year, they have put forward more ambitious, revised, and enhanced nationally determined contributions, so their national climate plans, on what and setting strong and robust targets out to 2035 to show how they are going to be putting in place actions and strategies and commitments to ensure that we are better in line with 1.5 degree trajectories. And it's very important for the G7 and G20 to take bold steps and show leadership in this regard, because they are responsible for 75% of emissions worldwide. And so it really will be representative of a step change should all of these countries take that bold action towards ensuring that they are doing, taking on their responsibility to ensure that they're putting in place actions to reduce emissions. And on top of that, supporting climate vulnerable developing countries to do the same, and providing that support through not only financial support, but capacity building, technology transfer and development, so that it's a continuous and shared endeavor across the world to ensure that each country is doing what they can and ambitiously so to address the climate crisis.
Yeah, and if I could complement Gabrielle with what she said, so we as trying to leverage the voices of vulnerable countries and communities, clearly identify major economies in the world, but definitely the G7 has a really strong responsibility in trying to support the transitions that are required by climate change in developing countries. And that's why the open letter that we launched last week, it is specifically calling for the G7 to, as Gabrielle was mentioning, to enhance their ambition and lead with the example in terms of emissions reductions, but also trying to target the financial side of things. So this year at COP29, COP29 has been labeled as the finance COP, because there is a massive negotiation that is happening now of a new climate finance goal that depending on how ambitious it is in the end, it can really be a game changer in terms of how financial flows, investments happen in the world. And the current situation where we are at now is that there is 100 billion goal that has existed in the United Nations climate framework since 2009, but only in 2022 was met for the first time, and this is an obligation and a commitment by developed countries. And so since it was agreed until now, the needs of developing countries in relation to rising temperatures and all of the impacts of climate change have only been growing. So when you look at what are the challenges ahead for vulnerable countries, we are speaking of trillions of dollars that are necessary to do actually reduce emissions, but also to adapt to the climate impacts and to address the losses and damages that derive from these impacts. So that amount, the 100 billion, is really, really low and a really small percentage of what is necessary. And as we all know, the G7 are the most powerful and the largest economic powers in the world. They basically represent 44% of the global economic output. So if we are to change anything for the future, and if this new goal is going to be something that really drives action in developing countries, the G7 have to commit to do something that is actually ambitious. Yeah, so as I was saying, one of the things that we are trying to portray in this letter is the idea that the needs of developing countries are in the trillions of dollars. So 100 billion goal is no longer fit for purpose in the kind of state of emergency that we are at with climate change. So that's one bit of what we are trying to say, and really calling G7 countries to be intentional about coming to COP29 and try to get an agreement that really looks into the needs of developing countries. Also, I think we are very much aware that there is a limit to public finance and how much it can be provided to climate change, because of course there are so many other development priorities, right, that public finance has to deal with. So we are talking that about the need to be really strategic in how resources are mobilized. So there are things in specific for vulnerable countries where there is a very strong need for core public finance to be provided in terms of grants or highly concessional funding in relation to adaptation and loss and damage, but also there's this need to mobilize other sources of funding, investments into developing countries through complementary resources. And we're speaking also about the need to be aware of the debt crisis that developing countries are at, and at a debt crisis that is only deepened by the way climate finance has been provided so far. Because you see, when you get a loan or a credit. Like if you have a credit card, you know that once you have a credit, you always have to repay it. And at times, you have to repay it with an interest rate. And that usually happens because you make a contract with a bank and you are in terms of just knowing that you have to provide repayments to the creditor bank. But climate finance is supposed to be international cooperation that supports developing countries in doing what they need to do. So there is a certain level of unfairness in most of climate finance being only market rate debt and not having any level of concessionality that actually help somehow developing countries to do more than they could do by just going to a development a bank or a regional bank, a multilateral bank. So we are also calling to have a deep look into that problem as part of the discussions of this new goal. And I'll just finish with this. When you look at the largest numbers of how investments are happening globally, you get to see that we actually have reached around 1 trillion, which is just 1% of the global output, of the global economic output on climate finance. But most of it stays in developed countries. So around, I think it is 75% of the global mobilization of climate finance stays in the global north, and it is not actually going to the developing countries. And but fossil fuel financing, which is the major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, it's like 4 to 7 times bigger in terms of how investments are flowing to these really high emissions intensive activities. So one additional call that we are making through this letter to the G7 is that we really need to see the implementation of one agreement that they had to eliminate inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, but also to end all fossil fuel financing, because something that happens with G7 countries is that maybe in their countries, but like they'll have lots of overseas fossil fuel financing that they don't count as something that is happening domestically, but is still just, fueling the climate crisis with money that could be given to renewable energies or different actions in developing countries. So I'll stop there if you have any questions.
This has always been the case, especially when we are heading towards COP. What exactly organization like yours are going to do differently this time round to ensure that developed countries actually comply with these commitment that they are supposed to execute to ensure developing countries get the enough financing that they need to combat the impact of climate change, because we've seen calls in the past, but the most important thing is always the result that we need. But at the end of the day, after COP, we see different things happening. What are we going to see differently this time around? And how does ACT 2025 propose G7 countries mobilize resources strategically to support ambitious and equitable climate outcomes?
I guess maybe I'll take a step back in the sense of the COPs can seem very repetitive. The COPs can seem, and the outcomes not very like they're giving much push towards big changes in the world. But the thing is, and the space of coming together at a multilateral level in this forum, where each country, big or small, rich or poor, has an equal voice at the table. This time around, and I'm thinking particularly in the negotiations around the new climate finance goal, is that unlike before, when the 100 billion goal was created, now every country is at the table and every country is putting forward and being part of the process. So the process in itself is quite different this year, where every country has a seat at the table and is ensuring that it's a shared endeavor in creating what this new climate finance goal is. So I would say that it's one, the process being different with everybody at the table is important, and also the fact that the COPs and the outcomes of the COPs have made material difference over the years. And as incremental and as maybe simple phrases such as transition away from fossil fuels may seem to the outside world, they hold grave and important and material effect on the world and how the world responds to what leaders are saying at COPs. And the COPs in that sense are very important to signal to the rest of the world the direction in which the world needs to head. And the fact that before the Paris Agreement was agreed in 2015, the world was on track for reaching 4 degrees Celsius. With the Paris Agreement now in place, with countries putting forward their nationally determined contributions and ratcheting up their ambition every 5 years as part of the rhythm of the Paris Agreement, we're now on track more towards 2.5 to 2.8 degrees. Still not there, still not enough. But the process is important to keep countries accountable to these commitments and to ensure that as they proceed and as years pass, they adjust and realign themselves towards trajectories that are in line with 1.5 degrees and the goals of the Paris Agreement. And so what ACT 2025 is doing particularly and doing differently is the essence of the negotiations is always at the heart of having negotiators and countries speak to one another instead of speaking past one another. And ACT 2025 is trying to support in creating spaces for countries to come together to take themselves out of the formality of the negotiations and really find themselves at the same table, really going into what's at the heart of the issues and how can we support building bridges and finding landing zones to get to an agreement that is just and fair and ambitious all around. And I'm sure Alejandra has.
Yeah, no. I think you just answered the question. I would just say, before this year, the only thing that we did was just launching our call to action and making a couple of webinars. And because this year we see that it is very, very important to push big countries, in particular the G7, to come forward with something ambitious for this new goal. It is that we did the G7 open letter, and we are also planning to continue doing sort of soft diplomacy, let's call it, to try to talk to different actors, to talk more about precisely this letter, and as Gabriel was saying, to convene different stakeholders to try to have spaces where they can try to come together into the big questions that surround this new goal. And I would say, just to finish, that we are planning to be very pushy and very vigilant of how the process ends up, together with many different networks of CSOs and think tanks that we are part of. So ACT 2025 is working together with other organizations and regions to try to really support the idea of how important it is to agree on an ambitious goal by COP29.
Finally, my final question has to do with recommendations. I mean, what do your recommendations for innovative financing solutions, including international taxes to increase grant funding and concessional support for climate action in vulnerable countries? What are your recommendations?
So I would say that maybe particularly on the international taxes part, we're supportive of any innovative tax so long as it doesn't have a material negative impact on climate vulnerable developing countries in its development and implementation. And there are lots of live conversations happening across various venues and fora at the moment in the negotiations around International Maritime Organization, the IMO, potential tax on shipping. There have been ideas and positions out there around potentially doing an airline tax through ICAO. In the G20, the Brazilian presidency is also floating the idea of a wealth tax. And so there are different ideas and propositions that are floating around, and it's a live conversation. And so long as the proceeds of such a tax find themselves back and channeled towards supporting climate vulnerable developing countries in their climate action across mitigation actions, adaptation efforts, and addressing loss and damage, these are the types of conversations that need to happen so as to be able to, recognizing, as Alejandra had said, that international public finance is limited, that these different venues and sources also need to be explored so long as that they benefit and not have a material negative impact on climate vulnerable developing countries. In 2 minutes.
Thank you.
No, not really. I think.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I'm so grateful. I would always keep in touch. And I would also be. You want to say something?
Yes, just to clarify, maybe I'll put in the chat a link to that specific quote. I just don't want to make sure. I want to make sure that the statistics are correct.
You can email it to me.
Okay, great.
Yeah, you can email it to me. And